All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope everyone's having a good day so far. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we start with our new lecture topic here. So we are currently in the midst of our first term quiz. So it's been available since yesterday at midnight, and it will close at 11:59 tonight. So make sure you log in at some point and you complete that quiz. So give yourself an hour to do the 10 multiple choice questions that are there. Tomorrow morning I'll release the grades for the term quiz, and that will start us into a 3-day period of rebuttals. So I'll post an announcement about the rebuttals, but the way these work is that if you want, so these are optional, you can choose any one question that you did not get full marks for on the quiz. And you can write basically an argument for why you feel that the answer you chose is actually a perfectly reasonable, logical answer to that question. And then I will evaluate those at the end of the week. And if I'm compelled by your argument, then I will give you an additional mark onto the quiz. And if I am not compelled, if I think there's a flaw in your argument, then I will deduct a half mark from the quiz. One of the things I will say, just kind of as advice here, there's a reason that there's a 3-day period here for these rebuttals. I've seen students in the past, the marks get released, say, tomorrow morning, and they see their mark, and they get really mad right away, and they're just like, I got a rebuttal, and they just write something really quick, and they submit it. And then I get this sheepish email the next day saying, now that I've thought about it, I don't really want to submit this rebuttal. So take some time, right? If you see the grade, take a breath, identify if there's a question you think you can make a really good case for, and take some time. There's no reward for getting the first rebuttal submitted for a quiz. So anyways, so you'll have to the end of the week to submit the rebuttals. I'll try to evaluate them over the weekend. And then, hopefully you're making progress on your short communications. Certainly, again, if you have any questions or need any feedback or advice on things, let me know. Happy to help out with that. Okay, so we start a new week with a new topic. We finished up immunity on Friday, and we're going to start today with our first of 3 lectures on the topics of nervous physiology. So we start today with organization and cells of the nervous system. We'll move on from there to talk about electrophysiology, and then we move on from there to talk a lot about sort of neurotransmitters, and we get into some details about specific neurotransmitters and receptors and things. And as I mentioned on Friday, part of the reason we cover so much nervous physiology in the course is because there are a few D-level courses where this content is necessary. So as I mentioned on Friday, when I tried to kind of thin out some of the nervous physiology stuff, didn't work out well, because then colleagues were like, hey, now my students don't know this stuff, and then I have to teach it to them. So it's kind of made its way back in. So hopefully, anyways, we'll be able to kind of cover the nervous physiology with enough time left over that we can also have a good, thorough discussion of reproduction at the end of the course. In any case, okay, so where are we going to start here? We're going to start in frozen mode. We're going to start by thinking about the functions of the nervous system. Apparently it's all frozen here. Hang on. Apparently I talked for too long. and the system got very unhappy with me as a result. Let's try this again. Okay, here we go. All right, so let's talk about the functions of the nervous system. There we go. Classically, we kind of describe 4 functions for the nervous system. These are very broad functions. So the first function of the nervous system is what we call sensory input. And as it mentions here, this is basically, the nervous system has to monitor what's happening both inside and outside of the body. So when we think about inside the body, your nervous system is monitoring things like, how full is your urinary bladder, what is your current blood pressure, these kinds of things. It's also monitoring the external environment, right? It's monitoring the light conditions, right, which of course leads to vision, and it's monitoring the sounds of the environment, and it's monitoring, it's monitoring whether you're being touched by something or not. Is something crawling on you, or these sort of things. So the sensory input function is all about monitoring what's going on inside and outside of the body. And I also add on to this notion of collecting information, because the way that we as humans collect information, of course, is through sensory input, right? You're collecting information right now, both by reading the words that are on the screen, using your eyes, both by listening with your ears to the words that I'm saying. A person could have a Braille textbook or something and could be collecting information through touch sensory input. So that's one of the functions of the nervous system, right? It's this monitoring of the internal and external environment and the collection of information. Function number 2 is a function that we call integration. So as it says here, this is about taking all these disparate pieces of sensory information that the body is collecting and basically trying to kind of stitch them together, if you will, to create a picture of the body's current status and knowledge. So I'll just give you a bit of an example. Let's imagine that right now, you see this boyfriend or girlfriend that you have, and they're kind of like grabbing at your arm, tugging at your arm right now. And you might think, oh, right in the middle of the day, we're going to go off and have some kind of fun activity together, right? That's kind of how you're processing that information. But if you imagine that you also are simultaneously hearing the fire alarm go off, well, then you're going to probably come to a different conclusion, that this person is actually trying to get me the hell out of this room that's on fire. So when we talk about integration, we're talking about how we get the most complete picture of what is happening to us by putting different pieces of sensory information together, right? In this case, we have to layer the kind of tugging sensory information together with, hearing the alarm to get a full picture so that we actually respond appropriately and we're not trying to make out while the building is on fire. And that works also for knowledge, right? When we talk about collecting information, our brain is responsible for integrating all that information together to create knowledge for us. And so hopefully, as you listen to the lecture today, you're kind of connecting that content with things you learned in Friday's lecture and things you'll learn in Thursday's lecture and maybe things you learned when you were in high school and, things you'll learn later in life. So we're always taking the information that we collect from our environment and we're, again, stitching it together to give ourselves a fuller understanding of that information. Then we have what's called motor output as the third function here. So this is where the nervous system stimulates the muscles and glands of the body that are necessary to respond to our current status or knowledge appropriately. So, for example, if you imagine that you are being tugged on because there's a fire alarm and this person is trying to help you escape the building, then of course your body has to figure out, okay, well, how do I get out of this building? What muscles do I have to contract so I can get up from my seat and run up the stairs and get out the door? So the nervous system is responsible for stimulating the muscles that are necessary in that case to respond appropriately, to vacate the room. And of course, glands also fall under here, right? So, as we're in this room, or maybe as you are walking over to the room and it's kind of warm outside, and so your body has detected that you're feeling warm, your body temperature is higher than it should be. Maybe we stimulate the sweat glands, right? So that you can do some evaporative cooling and try to cool down as you are walking to class. So that's kind of the motor output function. And then lastly, we come to the memory function of the nervous system. And so here, memory, of course, involves us storing knowledge and storing previous experiences that we've had, previous body statuses, so that we can use that information for future use, right? So that we can refine the way that we respond to the environment each time. And I'll give you again an example of the importance of memory here. So let's say you've got your boyfriend or girlfriend tugging at your arm, and the alarm is going off, and you know there's a fire and you have to vacate, and maybe you decide you're going to go out that door. So it says emergency exit, so I go out that door, and maybe I get out there and I find, holy shit, like there's tons of people here, and it's taking me forever to find my way to the actual exits of this building. So maybe the next time you're in this same room and there's that same scenario, there's a fire and the alarm is going off and you're being tugged at, maybe you say, okay, well, I remember that that was a terrible way out of this room, so I'm going to try that exit over there the next time, right? So in this case, memory and storing how we responded to a series of events the first time allows us to refine our future responses even to the exact same set of sensory input, all right? So that's the value of memory, right? It allows us to be able to modify our response to stimuli based on previous responses. Now, these four functions of the nervous system, they endow us with what I like to call the four capacities of the human body. And so the first of these capacities is called homeostasis. You're familiar with this term homeostasis, right? It means that you're trying to maintain some kind of, internal constancy within your body, right? Keep your body temperature the same, keep your body weight the same, whatever. And so to do this, to have homeostasis, you need all of these functions of the nervous system. So the example they give here is body temperature regulation, right? So they tell us here that we have these sensors, so nerve cells, for example, with endings in our skin and endings in our brain that are kind of monitoring the temperature of those regions of the body, right? Monitoring the temperature of the periphery of the body, monitoring the temperature of the more internal structures like the brain. And when those sensors are just monitoring, right? They're monitoring the temperature of the regions that they innervate, and they're sending that temperature sensory information to the temperature regulatory center in our brain, right? And so then it's our brain's job, and that temperature regulatory center in the brain, to take that information, that sensory information, that temperature data, essentially, that is being detected by these sensory nerve cells, and to then compare that sensory input, in this case, to the thermostat we have in our brain, right? To say, okay, well, in this case it says that the body temperature is exceeding 37 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature we're trying to keep our body at. So the brain says, okay, I've got this sensory information coming in telling me my body temperature is 39 degrees Celsius. It's getting too hot. It's not at the 37 I want it to be. So now we have to turn over to some motor output. We have to figure out how can we actually get our body temperature to go down. And so the temperature regulatory center can rely on motor output. We can send signals now to the sweat glands throughout our body, and they begin to secrete water, sweat onto our surface. And as that sweat evaporates, it helps us to bring our body temperature back down. Right? So we can see here clear roles for sensory input. We can see clear roles for integration. If you have, temperature information coming from various parts of the body, like the skin or the brain, and we can see a clear role here for motor output as well. We can also envision, although they don't talk about it here, a clear role for memory, right? You might say to yourself, well, I was sweating profusely the last time I came to this lecture hall. It's so fucking hot in here. Maybe the next time I come, I just won't wear that sweater, right? I'll wear a t-shirt, and therefore, hopefully, I'll be more comfortable, and I won't sweat. So we can see where memory comes in as well, right? So that's one of the capacities of the body. A second capacity that is endowed to us by the functions of the nervous system is complex behavior. The example I'll use here is this boy playing soccer, right? And if you've ever played soccer or any other sport, you know that all these nervous system functions are critical to playing that sport well. If we look at this particular kid right now, He's having to, for example, look around and monitor his environment, right? He's having to figure out where are the other players on his team. He's maybe listening to his coach or the referee or fans shouting out information. So he's got all this sensory input that he's gathering, where are the players, what commands are they yelling at me. He has to kind of integrate all that information together to get kind of a sense of like, okay, what is this situation that I currently find myself in? And then he's going to have to stimulate muscles that allow him to execute on whatever decision he makes here. Let's say he decides he's going to pass the ball over to another teammate. Of course, then he has to be able to execute the muscle contraction necessary to complete that pass. And we can also see where memory fits in here too, because let's say the first time he finds himself in this situation, he passes the ball over to a teammate, and then that ball rolls over the teammate's foot because that teammate's garbage, and it rolled over his foot and went out of play, and they lost possession. Maybe the next time he finds himself in that circumstance, he says, to hell am I going to pass? I'm not going to pass that ball over to this guy. He is talentless. Maybe I'll make a break for myself, and I'll try to shoot and score on the net, and maybe we'll get a better outcome. So again, we've got all these functions of the nervous system working together to allow us to have this complex behavior. Intelligence is another capacity that is endowed to us by our nervous system, right? And that's kind of going back to what I was talking about, collecting information and kind of stitching it together to create knowledge. The motor output function here would be us trying to maybe convey our knowledge to others, right? You asking a question after lecture or writing an essay or something, trying to convey your knowledge. That would be kind of the motor output side of intelligence. And of course, memory is a very key player there too, right? You have to remember all the information that you've collected previously, remember the ideas that you've come up with previously in order to be able to continue to build upon them for the future. And then lastly, I have this fourth capacity, which is adaptability. And so here we're talking about adaptability at the individual level, right? The ability of an individual to adapt to changing circumstances. And the example I give here is if you think about, this is kind of the migration of humans over the course of time. If you think about even just the migration of a single individual, right? If you think about maybe yourself, coming from, maybe deciding to leave Toronto, if you were born and raised here, and you think, okay, I'm going to leave this country and go somewhere else, or maybe you've come to this country from somewhere else, when you first, say, arrive in Toronto, or you arrive in your new place, obviously you're going to be using, your sensory input function to kind of monitor this new environment that you're in, right? Okay, I'm encountering new kinds of foods, new kinds of people, new kinds of environmental conditions. So I'm doing a lot of monitoring of this new environment, and I'm responding to it. But memory becomes really key in that adaptability, because let's say that you arrive in a new country for the first time. Maybe you arrived here in Toronto at UTSC for the first time. You've come from somewhere else, and the first day you are, crossing the road, and maybe you don't realize that, this hand that's up there means I'm not supposed to cross. So you just walk out to the road and honk, 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 car swerves around you. You're going to, remember that experience, and the next time you're going to be likely to respond differently to that environment, right? And that's key, because if every time you come here you just keep walking across the street willy-nilly, eventually you are going to buy the big one. You're going to get hit by a car. You're going to be dead. You're not going to be able to adapt to your new home, right? So we can see how, again, there's roles here for sensory input, clear roles for memory, in terms of being able to adapt to a new environment, for example. And, humans are a remarkably adaptable species, right? Both on evolutionary terms, but even on individual terms, right? If you think about, again, this sort of migration that has happened over generations of humans, it happens at the individual level fundamentally, where it happens as one person or groups of people kind of migrate into new areas, and they have to be able to sense this new environment. They have to be able to remember, I ate this berry off this plant and got really sick last time. I won't do that again. They have to be able to have those sensory functions, to have that memory, to be adaptable, right? And so consequently, you find that it's people who maybe are experiencing memory loss, right? Who suddenly really lose that ability to adapt to their environment, because they can't remember that, the last time I did this was the negative outcome I experienced, and so I won't do that again. if you're losing your memory, you're more likely to keep doing the same things over and over again, and you gradually become less able to adapt. So that gives you, again, kind of an overview of kind of what your nervous system is allowing you to do, right? What is your nervous system doing, and what capacities do you as a human being have because of these nervous system functions? Where I want to go next is I want to talk about the organization of the nervous system. And so we have this, again, very typical textbook figure talking about the organization of the nervous system. And we'll start at the top, and you already know this, that the nervous system is typically divided into these two major parts. So we have our central nervous system, which, as it says here, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then we also have the peripheral nervous system, which is comprised of the cranial and spinal nerves. So these are kind of the two big parts of our nervous system. As it says here, the central nervous system, well, actually, maybe I'll do the peripheral nervous system first. The peripheral nervous system, it says, is basically communication lines between the central nervous system and the rest of our body. So you can see within the peripheral nervous system, we have sort of a sensory and a motor part. So we need some way to connect all the various sensory organs, our eyes, our ears, all our various muscles, triceps, biceps, whatever. We need some way to connect those things back to the brain, right? And so that's what the peripheral nervous system's function is, right? These spinal and cranial nerves are linking the brain and the central nervous system to the various sensory and motor structures of the body. And then by comparison, the central nervous system here, it says, is comprised of integrative and control centers. And so these, we're going to elaborate on this in a second, but these are, basically integration centers, right? So we kind of, recognize that the sensory and motor output functions of the nervous system are kind of handled by the peripheral nervous system, but the integrative functions of the nervous system are largely the domain of the CNS. Memory also would be the domain of the CNS as well. So there's kind of that division of labor, if you will, between the CNS and the peripheral nervous system when you think about these various functions of the nervous system. What I want to do here is dive a little bit deeper for a moment into the central nervous system, talk about these integrative and control centers in just a little bit more detail. So the first slide that I showed you there, the functions of the nervous system, those four functions that I was talking about are, again, very broad functions. And partly, the nice thing about those four broad functions of the nervous system is that they apply very well not only to humans, but they kind of apply to the animal kingdom more broadly, right? Even if you're thinking about very basic animals like, a jellyfish or something, they still have those same basic nervous system functions. Maybe not as much memory, but they have that, monitoring the environment, maybe some degree of integration and response to the environment. So those four basic functions are kind of universal across the animal kingdom. This figure here gets into a little bit more detail about kind of how the relationship between sensory and integration and motor output works in the human case. And so we can begin looking at this diagram down at the bottom here. So we see the environment, and this arrow here, although it's not labeled anything, would basically be your sensory input, right? That you basically have sound and light and things from the environment that your various sensory organs are monitoring. And then what they show here is how that sensory information is first relayed to regions of the brain known as the primary sensory cortices. So for every different sensation that we have, vision, taste, touch, sound, all these different external sensory capacities that we have, there's a region in the brain that is dedicated to that particular sensation, right? We have a visual cortex and an auditory cortex and a gustatory cortex for taste and these sort of things. And so the sensory information that we are collecting from the environment is first relayed to these individual sensory cortices. And when the sensory information gets to these cortices, this is the point at which we become consciously aware of those stimuli. Okay, and this leads actually to an important point to mention here, which is this difference between sensation and perception, right? So our body senses a lot of stuff that we're not consciously aware of, right? And so sensation is just our sensory structures detecting something. You know, your eyes detecting light, that's sensation. But perception is you becoming consciously aware of that sensory information, right? And so it's entirely possible that you could be, staring blankly off into the distance, for example. How often have you done that, right? Where you clearly can see the people out there, right? But you might not notice one of them is waving their hand at you, right? Your eyes are detecting that because they're looking at that direction, but you're not actually consciously aware. You're not perceiving that sensation. So sensation is just the ability of our sensory structures to do this sensory input function, to collect that information. Perception occurs once we have relayed that sensory information back to these individual sensory cortices. Then we become consciously aware of what we are, for example, seeing or hearing or tasting or whatever the case might be. Now, as this figure also diagrams here, we could just take that sort of primary sensory cortex information, the vision that we're seeing, the sound that we're hearing, we could just rapidly relay that information over to our motor cortex, and then this would allow us to very rapidly respond to that information, right? And so here we have what they label as a reflex, right? I mean, classic reflexes, things like touching a hot stove and then pulling away, right? There, you basically have these sensory inputs, in the case of pain or temperature sensors, say in your fingers, that are basically kind of relaying that information at a very low level directly to the primary motor cortex, so you pull away from that hot stove rapidly, right? So reflexes are kind of this very low-level processing where we're sensing the environment, we're sending that sensory information to the primary motor cortex pretty rapidly, and then we can respond appropriately to the environmental stimulus. So it's a very kind of low-level processing, oftentimes meant to just provide us with a basic level of protection, right? Reflexes help to protect us. If I suddenly, throw my clicker in your direction and you see it and you block it away, well, that's great, because then you don't get dinged in the eye and you're like, oh, I'm blind, how am I supposed to learn now, right? So reflexes are very protective, kind of low-level processing. But as they also diagram here, we could actually send that information from the primary sensory cortex up to what's called the unimodal association cortex that is associated with that sense. And what happens now is you have this higher level of processing that occurs, because now it's not just a matter of having vision or hearing a sound and being aware of it, but now we transition over with the unimodal association cortex into understanding what we're seeing or hearing or tasting. What I mean by that is, here I am standing in front of you. I don't know if you can hear the sound here now. Anybody hear the sound? Right? So you know that because you're consciously aware of the sound, it has made it to your auditory cortex. What is this sound that you're hearing? Oh, I wish it were money. It's not money. Huh? It was my keys, yeah. Right? I don't have money in my pockets. They don't pay me enough to carry money in my pockets. But, you can hear my keys jingling there. So the thing is, there's a difference between hearing something and then being aware of what you're hearing and able to identify it, right? And so that's the job of those unimodal association cortices, that they allow you to make sense of the sensory input that you are perceiving, to identify that, this is my keys jingling in a person's pocket, to recognize that, oh, this is the taste of vanilla, that's on my tongue here, or this is a desk that I'm looking at, right? And then, of course, they mentioned that you can kind of go one step further, which is the polymodal association cortices. And this is where you start bringing, different pieces of sensory information together. This is really this highest level of integration, where we can bring multiple pieces of sensory information together to try and again, have that fullest picture of what is happening, right? So this is where, again, you might have put together, visual information that, oh, this is my girlfriend or boyfriend. Oh, I can feel that they're tugging on my arm. Oh, I can hear there's a fire alarm. And the polymodal association cortices can put all that different sensory information together to allow you to realize, oh, the building's on fire, this person's trying to help me out. So we can keep elevating information to higher and higher levels of integration. And this is true on the motor side as well, right? You've got your primary motor cortex that simply is going to stimulate the muscles of your body so that you can move. But then you also have, at the higher level, the premotor cortex that is actually planning out these movements, right? Trying to figure out, okay, well, your arm is currently down by your side and I need it to come up in front of your face to block a ball. How exactly do I do that, right? Because you want to have this nice, smooth muscle contraction in that case to protect yourself. You don't want to be your arms flailing around and eventually they get there. And then you've got your prefrontal cortex at the highest level here, responsible really for you to kind of initiate the whole process, right? Especially when we're talking about conscious initiation of movement, right? If you decide that you're going to get up and leave, as an example, right? Your prefrontal cortex starts and it has to make that decision. Okay, I have somewhere to be, I need to get up and I need to go. And then, once you've made that decision, the premotor cortex can then say, okay, well, you're currently sitting in a seat. Here are the muscle contractions we're going to have to do in order to actually get you up and out. And then they can send those instructions to the primary motor cortex, and then it can actually stimulate those muscles so you execute the movement that you want. So again, even on the motor side here, we can see that there are kind of layers to the sort of integration of information. Now, what I want to highlight here is that the kind of neuronal pathways that kind of go up and down through these different hierarchical levels here, the neurons that are doing that sort of, moving of information from one level to the next, they are known as the pyramidal neurons. So we have these pyramidal neurons in our brain that are really responsible for kind of carrying information, from one hierarchical level to the next, right? To get information from, say, our primary sensory cortex to our unimodal or polymodal association cortices, we have these pyramidal neurons that are responsible for those kind of, again, information flows between these different hierarchical levels in both the sensory and the motor side here. But then what I also want to impress upon you is that we additionally have these kind of regulatory centers in the brain that can regulate the action of these different brain regions, right? And so as an example here, let's think about the prefrontal cortex. We said this is a part of your brain that kind of, is where your initiation of movement starts, right? You say, okay, I need to get up and go because I got another class, I got to go to the bathroom, it's too hot in here, the person next to me is annoying me, whatever the case might be. And so you have to initiate that movement, and it happens at the prefrontal cortex, but then you have this regulatory system, this motivation reward system that regulates the prefrontal cortex. Maybe you're sitting there thinking, I really should get up and go to the bathroom, but I just don't feel like moving right now. I'll take my chances. I hope I can hold it in before, the lecture is over. Or you might say to yourself, well, I really should go to the gym after class today, right? But I don't really feel like it. Or maybe you can go the opposite. Maybe you go to the gym today and they say, oh, we gave $100 to everyone who showed up today. And so Thursday you're like, oh, I'm definitely going to go back. I want to go. I want to go to the gym again. Hopefully they're going to be $100 again. So we have these modulatory, regulatory mechanisms in our brain. This motivation reward modulation on our prefrontal cortex. Over here it talks about, the arousal systems and how they can kind of regulate our association cortices here. So we're talking here about like how alert are you, right? So again, you could be looking straight at me and your brain is seeing me and you have a vision of me, but maybe you zone out, right? And you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, right? In that case, it could be that you're tired or you're just not really paying attention. So your arousal system has kind of shut down these higher level processing parts of the brain. So you're only doing this basic visual processing. I see he's there, but I'm not really paying attention. Or there's memory too, right? Going back to when I was jingling my keys, part of your ability to identify what that sound is is you're relying on your memory, right? You're relying on, well, what have I heard in the past that sounded like that? Right? That's how we got the answer. Maybe it's money, coins in his pocket, right? Because the last time I heard people jangling coins in their pocket, it sounded kind of similar. So that's a reasonable guess to have made. So your memory also regulates these things too. What we need to appreciate is that the neurons that are responsible for this kind of regulatory function in the brain, those neurons are known as interneurons. So you have pyramidal neurons kind of relaying, the sensory and motor information into different, hierarchical levels within the brain. But then you have these interneurons that are playing this regulatory role, right? They're kind of controlling the flow of information, if you will, through the brain. And of course, that then allows you to, again, modulate, your sensory and motor responses to information differently. And one of the things that's really cool about this whole kind of interneuron regulatory function is we have this growing evidence to suggest that this is perhaps key to a species' intelligence. I'm going to start talking now a little bit here about something called the connectome. And so the connectome is basically this idea of trying to map out all the neuronal connections within the nervous system, especially the brain. Right, trying to map out all the connections between neurons within the brain. And so I'm going to show you some data here from a study done a few years ago. They were trying to do connectomes of the cerebral cortex only, right? Because we're now talking about mammals, as you can see, pretty complex mammals, so they can't do the whole brain. But they were doing connectomes of chunks of cerebral cortex. And they had samples from mouse. They had samples from macaques, so primates, and they had samples here from us, from humans. And they were trying to look at the connectome, look at the neurons within the cerebral cortex of these three animals, and trying to figure out, okay, well, humans are probably the most intelligent of these three species. What accounts for the intelligence that we as humans have? And the first thing that they pointed out here, and you can sort of see this pretty clearly, I think, in the figures, is that the density of neurons within the cerebral cortex doesn't appear to have changed as we go from mouse to macaque to humans, right? We have just as many neurons packed into a given volume of mouse brain as we have packed into a given volume of human brain, right? So if you were thinking to yourself, well, maybe one of the things that contributes to human intelligence is that we kind of have more densely packed neurons or something, this study certainly says that's probably not the case. We're seeing as much neuronal density in the mouse brain as the human brain, and yet, at least based on our own perception, mice are not nearly as smart as we are. On the right-hand side, what the same study showed is that a big difference between the mouse and the human brain was the interneuron to interneuron connectome. How interconnected these regulatory neurons, these interneurons, were. They found actually a 10-fold expansion of the interneuron to interneuron network in humans compared to mice. And so they argue in this paper that perhaps an important contributor to human intelligence is that you have this better regulation, right? That there's all the regulatory systems of the human brain are very intimately connected to each other, and that allows for much more kind of specific and nuanced and controlled regulation of brain function, and perhaps intelligence then emerges as a result. I'll give you a little bit of an example here. So if you imagine that we've got this classroom and there's a learning that's going on here, right? So your intelligence development depends on how effectively I'm able to communicate information to you, okay? But let's imagine that we think about all the kind of regulatory players at the university who kind of regulate this space, right? There's the registrar's office who has to book the classroom space. There's campus safety, who has to make sure that the space is safe for all of us to be in, for example. We have all these different kind of regulatory pieces that work at the university. And let's imagine that they don't communicate with each other at all, right? And so here we're in the middle of our class, and all of a sudden a bunch of campus safety officers come in and they say, oh, we're going to be running a campus safety drill right now. And so they're running a safety drill in the middle of this class. How's that going to impact your ability to learn? It's going to make it a disaster, right? They've got sirens going off, they've got people faking deaths, and they're trying to do all these things, and I don't know, they're doing all kinds of campus safety things, whatever they do, right? But they're doing it in the midst of us trying to learn. You would say, okay, well, this is going to make it very ineffective, right? But the problem here, of course, was the registrar's office who scheduled this class didn't communicate with the campus safety office who scheduled that event, and so you ended up with this problem that ultimately compromised your learning ability. But if we can get those two offices to collaborate, be connected, share information, then we ensure that the campus safety folks only come to do their drill when there isn't a class scheduled here, and that we don't interrupt the learning process. So in a similar way, if we think about all these different regulatory systems that exist in the human brain, if those systems are connected well and can share information well, then ultimately you get better regulation of brain function. You get better regulation of the flow of sensory information, better regulation of the flow of motor output, better integration of information between those two systems, and that sets the stage for intelligence. So that's what data like this is heavily suggesting, that the expansion of the interneuron network, the increasing interconnectivity of brain regulatory centers seems to be key to, or at least a contributing factor to the development of human intelligence. Sticking with the connectome for just a little bit longer here, the first complete connectome for an animal brain came out a few years ago, and it was from this little worm here, C. elegans. Right? This is a very common research animal, partly because of its simplicity, and they were able to actually map out the connectome of the entire brain of C. elegans, which was partly facilitated by the fact that it has a very simple brain. Right? There are only 302 total neurons in the brain of C. elegans. You compare that to the estimates of the human brain, as we're talking about 86 billion neurons or something. It's a much bigger number, obviously. So C. elegans, they were able to, this research group was able to map out the connectivity of all the neurons within the brain of C. elegans. And one of the cool things they learned from doing this study is they identified that there are 3 different types of neuronal connections that they found within the brain of C. elegans. So the first type that they found are what they call these stable connections. So these are basically neuronal connections that are constant across all individuals within the species. They were connections between neurons that they found in every single C. elegans brain that they looked at. Then there were what they call developmentally dynamic connections. So these were connections that were the same in all of the C. elegans brains that they observed, but that the strength of that connection seemed to vary over time, over developmental time, right? So sometimes that connection was kind of weak, and other times it was quite strong. And then lastly, they identify what they call variable connections. These were connections that were different among all the different C. elegans that they examined. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at the adult case here, you can see that the variable connections make up almost half of all the neuronal connections in the C. elegans brain. So what's really interesting about this, as the authors noted, every C. elegans brain, every C. elegans animal has connections between neurons in its brain that aren't found in other individuals. They're unique to that individual, variable among individuals. And that variable type of connection represented nearly half of all the neuronal connections. And what makes this even more remarkable of an observation is that all of the C. elegans that they examined in this study, they were all genetically identical to each other. So we have this genetically identical population of C. elegans, and yet notwithstanding the genetic identical nature of these brains, we're seeing almost half of the neuronal connections here are variable, differing among the individuals, right? And this sort of tells us, I think, that there is this tremendous, I guess it kind of tells us that the connectome is certainly not laid out genetically, right? The connectome is clearly influenced by environmental conditions. It's clearly influenced by, I guess, developmental patterns, but it's not laid out genetically. right? And so we can see variation among even genetically identifiable or genetically identical individuals in the level of the connectome. And again, what's kind of interesting about this is when people talk about, brains being wired differently, from one person to another, right? This is kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about there being these variable neuronal connections that can exist. And again, if they're seeing this level of variability in the connectome with genetically identical individuals, imagine how much variability in the connectome must exist in the human brain when you think about all the genetic diversity that we have within the human population, right? So in any case, I wanted to put that out there. This is just a bit of an, it fits with the connectome here, but there's nothing really to teach you about here other than to say that the most recent connectome that was published was just last year. As you can see, October of 2024, they actually finished the connectome of the Drosophila brain, right? That's 140,000 neurons, so much more complex than the C. elegans brain. It's only 302, but far less complex than the human brain at 86 billion. I checked before I posted these lectures. I haven't seen any other connectome come out since last year, so I think this is still the most recent of the connectomes. What we'll perhaps end with here is just talking a little bit about this idea of control centers in the central nervous system. So we have a bit of a sense now about kind of the various integrative centers of the brain. Let's talk a little bit about control centers of the brain. This figure here is showing us that there are two major regions of the brain where there are these control centers that help us to regulate some pretty basic functions of the brain, of the body rather, I should say. The first of these is the hypothalamus. So that's this little kind of pink region they're highlighting here. You can see that it sits just above the pituitary gland, which is this structure right here. The hypothalamus is a major location for control centers in the brain, and they highlight three major control centers that are found there in the hypothalamus. One is they talk about heat control. So this is where the thermostat, our body's thermostat is located, is in the hypothalamus. So this is about controlling body temperature. We also have a water balance control center in the hypothalamus, right? So we need to be able to maintain the osmolarity of our body fluids, right? We need to be able to maintain, a certain amount of water in the body, a certain amount of salt dissolved in that water to make sure that we can not have water flowing into and out of our cells in ways that could lead to cells swelling and bursting or shrinking and shriveling. So we have water balance centers in the hypothalamus. We also have feeding control centers. It's important that we maintain proper energy balance, right? That we maintain relatively constant weights, right? To try and prevent us from becoming obese, but also to prevent us from becoming too thin and therefore prone to starvation. So this body temperature control, this water balance, this feeding control, all happening within the hypothalamus. And then the other major region where we have control centers is in the brainstem. So there's two parts to the brainstem. There's the pons, the higher part, and the medulla, which is the lower part that connects to the spinal cord. And you can see that within the two regions of the brainstem, we have, again, a variety of control centers. There's one controlling our urinary bladder, so allowing us to avoid our bladder when it gets full. The pneumotaxic and the respiratory center, they control our breathing rate, allowing us to speed up and slow down our breathing. And then you can see there are cardiac acceleration and cardiac slowing centers, again, allowing us to control our heart rate, speed it up and slow it down to match the body's demands. Let me just give you a little bit of insight here into one of these control centers in particular, and it'll really highlight for us how integration of sensory information works within the brain and specifically within these control centers. So we're looking here at the respiratory center of the medulla. And what the picture I've got up here now shows is that there's a ton of sensory inputs that are coming into that respiratory control center, and that center, therefore, has to integrate all that different sensory information to then make a decision, which is, should I speed up your rate and depth of breathing, or should I slow it down? So if we look at the various inputs here, they talk about chemosensors, right? There are peripheral chemosensors that are present in the vasculature, central chemosensors that are present in the brain. These are monitoring how much oxygen and carbon dioxide is in the body. And so obviously, if there's, say, too little oxygen in your blood, for example, the peripheral chemoreceptors will detect that, and they'll send a signal to the respiratory control center. And that might lead you to start breathing deeper or faster to try and bring more oxygen in, for example. You can see here that there are these mechanostretch receptors in your muscles and joints. They also send sensory information back to the respiratory center. This is because, if your joints are moving, and so these sensors are getting stretched out, for example, if you're moving, that presumably means you're active. And if you're active, then you're going to have greater need for oxygen and greater need to get rid of CO2. So in that case, we want to, again, speed up the depth and the rate of our breathing. On the other side here, you can see that there are stretch receptors that are present in our lungs. So these are trying to ensure that if our lungs get too inflated, we don't want the elastic fibers in our lungs to start to rupture and damage our lungs. So we have these stretch receptors that say, oh, the lung is getting too inflated. Maybe we send a signal back to the respiratory center to stop any further inhalation. We also have irritant receptors in our lungs, so that if we're breathing in irritants, smoke particles, for example, right, they're going to bind to these irritant receptors in the lungs, and then that maybe sends a signal to the respiratory control center to say, hey, let's slow down our breathing. Let's slow down the rate and depth of our breathing. We don't want to be inhaling all these irritants. You can see here that there's information, so pain and emotional information is fed in to the respiratory control center. We're all aware of how sometimes if you're crying, your breathing pattern sort of changes a bit. And that's partly because you've got this pain and emotional information being sent into the respiratory center. And then also it talks there about higher brain centers, right? And how we have voluntary control over breathing too. Right? You can hold your breath right now if you want to. You can start, pretending you're hyperventilating if you want to. This control over breathing, this voluntary control, is also vital for speech, right? Because the whole time that you're saying words, you're exhaling, right? And so when you're not saying anything, you kind of breathe very rhythmically in and out, in and out. But when you start speaking, right, you have these like big inhalations, and then you speak, and you're exhaling that whole time, and then big inhalation. Right? And so we have all these different inputs that are coming into the respiratory control center. And it has to take all that sensory information that it's receiving from all these different locations, and ultimately it only gets to make one decision from all that information. Do I speed up the rate of breathing? Do I breathe deeper? Or do I slow down the rate of breathing and I breathe more shallowly? And so it's got to take all that different sensory information that it's receiving to ultimately make that decision. Okay, I'm going to stop there. We'll probably touch a little bit upon this again on Thursday, but that's good for now. I'll see you then. I have to be back to my office by 1:30, but I've got some time.
Oh yeah. Quick question, just to confirm. So, for the regulatory systems that you mentioned with with interneurons,
Yeah.
would they be more so like overriding the other other systems because you said the motivation system, like it maybe could be a sort of your body thinks, oh yeah, you should be doing this, but then your interneurons say, well, no, right?
Well, it's sort of like, it's not, I wouldn't use the word override necessarily, but again, modifying maybe is a better word. So it's almost like, again, you could be sitting here today and think to yourself, I should go to the gym, right? And maybe today you get up and you go to the gym and you work out, and then Thursday after class you say the same thing, I should really go to the gym today, but then you don't. So in both cases, the prefrontal cortex is kind of, put this thought into your head, I should go to the gym, but then the motivation, reward parts of the brain have altered that or modified that idea in a way that leads you to either go or not go. So It's not, it's override if you think about I didn't go, did I get overridden? But it's also it can go the other way too, where it's it can enhance your likelihood of going, right? Because, again, maybe like I said, the last time you were there, you had a great workout, or you felt really good afterwards, or a cute girl was there, or something. I don't know. You have these modifying actions
So more so, I guess you could say it was more so to give like a final say in a way, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a modulator,
Modular.
right? I don't want to say like I don't like the word override or final say. I like the idea that it's modulating the likelihood
Okay.
that you're going to actually initiate this task that you thought of.
Okay. So it'll dictate if you're gonna kind of. Okay, I get it.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
What class is this that you teach here?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Is this your last week on the job here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not last week on the job.
Well, last week on the
Yeah,
course.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
So who comes in after you?
Arthi.
Arthi comes in.
Usually it's Yan and Arthi, but they switch
They
this.
switch this year. Okay. All right. All right. Well,
Okay, take it easy.
have fun.